tonight, but I thought also just a little brief of, you know, why we're here, and
Sure.
basically a little overview. So we're broadcasting live from, well, we're not broadcasting live, but you never know, tomorrow. Here we are in, how would you say, Saint-Remy? Saint-Remy, and welcome Vincent Bridges and Dan Winter and our wonderful group.
We're in this beautiful spot, you know, lovely surroundings, you know, nice early 18th century chateau with an artificial ley line, you know, wonderful grounds, you know, swans, Roman aqueducts, you know, lovely stuff. So we're going to sort of use this logistically as the center point of our spiral, and we're just going to spiral out from here. And as we spiral out, we have three different stories that are all the same story, but looked at from different perspectives or different ways of sorting through it. And the first sort of story, which is the big, broad wave, in which all these little waves, right, is the possibility of an alternative form of Christianity that really has very little to do with Christianity and is so alternative that it may even be the Western version of Buddhism. And that sort of larger story goes under the code name of the Holy Grail. But there's a lot more to it than just, oh, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, or the Merovingians, or whatever. Essentially, the story that ends in Septimania, Languedoc, and the Pyrenees, that's the end of the story. The beginning of the story is here. So if you've been looking at Rennes-le-Château and Languedoc and the Pyrenees and the Cathars and Montségur, you're looking at the end of the story. And, you know, that's not very pretty. Okay? So while this one, it doesn't have all the drama and etc., does have some highs and lows, the beginning of the story is much different from the way it all crashed and burned. But that's the larger story, the true history of the Holy Grail. By the time it got to the Cathars and by the time it got to the folks who wrote the Grail legends down, you had to be very careful what you said. And even though the church never really prohibited the Grail legends or thought they were, you know, good or bad, they tried to ignore them. There's a core of the Grail legends that truly challenges the Catholic Holy Mother Church. And the reason for that is that Catholicism really wanted to be the universal religion. You know, to pull all the old pagan threads together, make them all work together for the good of the empire. And eventually, of course, if you didn't agree, well, of course, you know, you're a heretic. At the very least, we're going to banish you from Rome, and at the very worst, we're probably going to kill you. So it gets darker and darker. What started out maybe as a good idea in a broad sense gets darker and darker and darker. But once upon a time, there was a sort of an alternative. And that alternative, ground zero for it, is between where we're sitting now and the Mediterranean at St. Marie de la Mer. And what we're really looking at is something that is Christianity only in 1,000 years retrospect. I'm not really sure what the people here in the first century would have called it, but they wouldn't have called it Christianity. Now, this whole area is very peculiar, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. Because it's the one spot in this part of the world where all of the major old world cultures overlapped. In other words, one of the first sort of noteworthy pieces of civilization was the Egyptian trading port that's now a kilometer or so off the beach at St. Marie, Delaware. And that dates from roughly the time of Tutankhamun or a little earlier, 18th dynasty. So as early as that, the Egyptians were trading with the Proto-Celtic, Ligurians, megalithic. We don't even really know because they didn't have that much of a language. And what language that we put on the Ligurians came much later. So we don't really know what to call these people. But first the Egyptians came, set up a little trading post, and went fairly far up the Rhone. We really don't know how far. And then the Greeks followed them. The earliest version of Jason and the Argonauts has Jason sailing west through the Straits of Sicily, going up the mouth of a great river to a big lake, over some really high mountains to another great river, and coming down into the Adriatic near Greece. So that's sailing around Sicily, coming to the mouth of the great river, the Rhone, going up the Rhone to Lake Geneva, over the big mountains to the Po River, coming down through Torino and out to the Adriatic. Now, most of even the later Greeks thought that that had to be rubbish because, you know, who'd ever heard of going that way. But archaeologically, there are some remnants. The ancient name for Arles was Arlite, and that R syllable is traceable back to Argo. So perhaps even Jason was here. At any rate, the Greeks, very quickly after the Egyptians, built a trading post in what's now Marseille. And this whole area became Celto-Ligurian, Proto-Celt, Ligurian, Greek, with a slight Egyptian influence. And that sort of worked along fine until Rome got to be a great power. And the very civilized Greek Ligurian culture here was threatened by the barbarian Celts from northern France. And rather innocently, they asked the Romans for help. And the Romans said, well, right time then, sure, let's march our legion over, and refused to leave. So it became Rome. Now, Hannibal, on his way to sack Rome in the Second Punic War, crossed the Rhone somewhere between Tarascon and Arles, not quite sure, and then went up the Vaucluse into the French Alps, and just like Jason, came out the Po River then. So, very long history of winding through here. Finally, the late 2nd century BC, early 1st century BC, this was the end of the trading route that led from northern Italy, Switzerland, Baltic countries. All of those roads, including the Rhone, tended to end up right in this region. And that's why just down the road in Tarascon is the oldest fair, merchant fair in Europe, at probably 2,100 years old. They've been doing it. Because that's where all the old roads ended. You got all your stuff, and merchants from other places would come and have a great bazaar. So Julius Caesar, of course, made great friends with the locals. His expedition to Egypt, they built the ships between Arles and Grail, St. Marie, Delaware. So history. Soon after Julius Caesar's time and the early emperors, several interesting political changes happened. And one of those political changes we'll see on some monuments. And in that time period, there was a governor, a Roman governor by the name of Marcus, and his beautiful wife, who was the priestess of Isis or Cybele, and a young, noble Celtic wacko, who apparently was charmed by the witch up on the hill and fallen in love with her. And hey presto, 1,000 years later, we have Tristan and Isolde.
The witch up on the hill.
The witch up on the hill.
With Whitwitch.
Yes. Well, there's actually a marble, a sculpture up next to Lebeau that shows the story. And you can also read the story off the monuments. So Tristan and Isolde started. Move forward a little bit in time, you know, the Romans and all that, things fell apart, things got bad, things got worse. Constantine cut a deal with the Christians of Arles to put him sort of in the forefront of the battle for the Western Roman Empire. And thanks to the support of the Arlesians, Constantine conquered and became emperor. And eventually, of course, created Orthodox Christianity. And very soon thereafter, things began to go downhill again. Now, a couple of centuries after Constantine, the Merovingian king Clovis II was on his way to fight the remnants of the Roman Goths, Vandals down in Arles. And he stopped down the road here with his army one night and camped. And the Merovingians had been converted to Christianity by Saint-Remy, Rheims in northern France. So Clovis camped down below the Les Antilles, had this dream in which Saint-Remy appeared to him and predicted that one day, he would be king of Jerusalem and all these wonderful things. So Clovis was so grateful for this wonderful future prognostication that he gave this area to Saint-Remy, and that's why it's Saint-Remy de Provence. In other words, Saint-Remy, Rheims in northern France, this is the southern France version. So again, Merovingians, hey, what could be better, right? Then, 100 years, 150 years or so later, we have the delightful story of St. Maurice and the Theban Legion. Now, St. Maurice is Egyptian, and as you'll see when we get to the Gypsy Festival, there's still Egyptians here, or people who believe they're Egyptians, real gypsies from Egypt, gypsies. And in fact, they have their own saint, St. Mary, St. Sarah, and the two Marys when they came over are sort of the origin point of Christianity. So, St. Maurice and his Theban Legion, our Lite at that point was known as Thebes, the Western Thebes. They had a variant form of Christianity. We don't really know how variant, but we know it was somewhat pagan because they had the original 4 hallows of the Grail. They had the sword that eventually became Charlemagne's sword. They had the spear that became the Spear of Destiny that's in Austria. They had, what am I missing? The chalice that's up in Mount Zion in Switzerland, which is a cup carved from the meteoritic Cabele stone. And they had a platter, which was a gravestone. And the gravestone was sacred for a variety of reasons, not least of which is it had an Egyptian ankh on it. And a mysterious saint known as Saint Trophime, or Saint Triumph, a holy triumph, had impressed his knee print in it in about 52 AD. So St. Maurice and the Legion was instructed to kill heretical Christians, and they refused. And first of all, they were decimated. 1 man in 10 was killed, and they still refused. And then orders were given for the whole 6,000-man Legion to be wiped out. So most of them died up where the cup is in Zion in Switzerland. But refugees went all the way down the Rhone, and we know where most of them were caught and killed. And the last one was killed somewhere between here and Arles. Now, 3 of the 4 hallows that St. Maurice had, we know what happened to them. The 4th, the platter with the knee print in it, was lost, or it made it back to Arles. Now, it just so happened that in the next couple hundred years, after St. Maurice, the cult of Saint Trophime grew up in Arles in the old Roman cemetery called the Alchamps. And there is a little church called the Holy Honor of holding the triumph or the trophy, in which the ankh, Grail stones, the knee print in it, occupied the center of the chapel. And there the story rested until things got really interesting in the 12th century. 12th century, of course, Crusades, Templars, Knights of StJohn, all sorts of entertaining other stuff going on. And in the midst of that, they decided to build a Gothic front on the old Romanesque church in Arles. And that's the Church of St. Trophime. Now we'll take a look at that, and the Gothic sculptures and designs on the front of the church are truly unique. And they include secrets about the universe and concepts of who we are and what we are that you find nowhere else in Western art. Okay? So it's like, how did this get here? And one of the reliefs tells the story of the 3rd wise man, Balthazar. The reason for that is the people who owned the castle right over the hill at Le Beau thought they were descendants of the third wise man, Balthasar, and they were supporters of Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had decided that it was time to bypass Rome because he couldn't get himself crowned emperor by the Pope, and that he would have himself crowned emperor by the King of Arles, since Arles was the last remaining piece of the old Roman Empire. So they had a big celebration in 1176, just as the front of the St. Trophimae church was finished. And they brought the Grail stone, tombstone, whatever, from St. Honoré to St. Trophimae. And everybody who was anybody in the 12th century came to Arles to party down with Frederick and celebrate his coronation as the King of the Romans. Now, among that crowd were Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote the first Grail story, and his patrons, Philip of Flanders, and also Wolfram von Eichenbach, as a young knight, who would write the best Grail story, Parzival. So, in one little spot, just down the road there, all of the Grail legends started and kind of grew outward from there. And since they all seem to be telling the same story, it's logical to say, where did that story come from? So both Chrétien and Wolfram talk about the fact that the story came from some astronomer, philosopher, who had the whole story written in the stars, had a very odd Hebrew, Persian name, could be either one. Well, up at Le Beau, which has the height to have a 360-degree unobstructed view of the horizon, and a 280-degree view of the southern horizon that goes all the way to the Mediterranean, where you can very accurately determine the azimuth of stars, the rising and setting of stars, very accurately. So the sages, the druids, for want of a better word, had an observatory up in the Valley of the Ancients, or the Valley of Hell, as the Christians call it, and at the castle of Le Beau, and it's entirely likely that the druidic sages here were, in fact, the Balthasar, the third wise man. So all of this kind of overlaps in where the Grail story came from. Did the sages at Le Beau have some prophecy predicting the story of the Grail? Was that the book that Philip of Flanders gave to Chrétien de Troyes to write the Grail story from? And because also Wolfram, who continued Chrétien's story and actually elaborated on it and turned it into a masterpiece, seems to be writing from the same sources, but more accurately. Where is that source? Well, the only logical overlap point is somewhere here. So, what's the real connection? Since no one has heard of or seen the gravestone with the knee imprint in it since roughly 1176 when it was moved to the new church, we could sort of speculate that maybe there's a connection between St. Maurice's platter and the platen Grail stone of the myth. So we can sort of speculate that, and about the same time that the Grail story started, the Catholic Church and the French king launched the greatest genocide in human history, the destruction of the Cathars, in which everyone of the old tradition, from as far up as Orange and the Vaucluse, down to the Mediterranean and west all the way to Spain and across the Pyrenees, were wiped out. In that 60-year span, more people died than were killed by Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong.
You're joking.
Absolutely not. And not only just people, but the culture. In other words, to this day, there are areas down where Dan lives where there's still castles, still towns up on the hillside that are in the same ruins that Simon de Montfort left them in 1218. So one of the worst genocides in human history was supported by the Catholic Church and the French crown. And when they were done by the mid-13th century, the entire tradition was gone, was lost. The few survivals were really minor and in odd places far in the hills, and this whole area was white clean. And, you know, the ones of you who had the splendid opportunity earlier today to wander up to Avignon can see an example of what happened. In other words, the Pope just decided, since they killed everybody in that region, that they would just claim it. And then the French king said, well, you know, I kind of want my own Pope, so we'll just move Rome over here to Avignon. And for 200 years, all the riches of the Pope, everything that was made from the scam of indulgences and tithes and etc., all the negative money-grubbing aspect of the Catholic Church poured through Avignon. And they spent like drunken sailors on the weed. You know. We would think of them as nouveau riche, you know, with the toys and the fast cars and the high life and etc., except churchly. Their toys were relics, you know. Still the high life. You know, their fast car was a good carriage with springs in it and things like that. Which truly, in the 14th century, was a luxury on these roads, for sure. So that sort of overlay forced everything into a very different perspective during that whole time period. And of course, at the beginning of the 14th century, one of the remaining powers in this region that had stood sort of on the sidelines while the Cathars were murdered got their turn, the Templars. And the Templars, who did not get caught up in the Friday the 13th roundup, were allowed by the Pope to join the Knights of St. John, and most of their lands in Provence were transferred directly to the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, which eventually became the Knights of St. John of Malta, and is still around. So that's another weird little kink. Some of the Templars went to Scotland, some of them went to Switzerland. We're not going to talk as much about the Templars as some of you might like. It's a little bit off our story. But by the early 14th century, there was a whole new culture from here around, very French. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. But here, where they're used to absorbing all sorts of different cultures, it's like, sure, we'll be French, who cares? You know, hung on to their language a little bit, but fine. Now, in the 15th century, this was the Duchy of Provence, which had connections to the House of Savoy in northern Italy. And the House of Savoy had been fighting the Catholic Church at that point for 500 years. And they were intermarried with the counts and dukes of Provence. And then the Duchy of Provence passed to René of Anjou, Good King Rene, we like to call him. And Good King Rene was obsessed with the Holy Grail story. So he spent pretty much every dime he had looking for Holy Grails throughout this whole region. He's the one responsible for building the lovely church at St. Marie de la Mer, where the Sarah the Gypsy statue is in the crypt. And he did a lot to restore various things here. Oh, and by the way, his hero was St. Maurice. Okay? So, we're little overlaps. And we get to the second part of our story, Nostradamus. Nostradamus' maternal grandfather was Good King Rene's doctor in his final days. Unfortunately, Nostradamus was very young when his maternal grandfather died. He probably never met him, or could certainly never learn from him, but he did inherit some of his grandfather's astrological devices, okay, which he passed on to his son. So even though the connection is not as direct, you know, of, oh, he taught him Latin, etc., that connection to King Rene meant that Nostradamus and Nostradamus' family had a certain sort of perspective on this region that was lacking. Now, Nostradamus' family story, around the time that the Christians arrived, the Jews had been here for about 100 years. One of the early Roman emperors who didn't make it to be emperor, was one in the line of the Julio-Claudius, a fellow by the name of Germanicus, cut a deal with the Jews to move as many Hebrews as possible from those troublesome Holy Lands in Palestine, where they just couldn't, to Alexandria first, and then from Alexandria to here, to the town of the hill. So in addition to being Proto-Celtic, Ligurian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, they're also Hebrew. So the Jewish community here flourished between the 1st century AD and about the 8th century AD, when, due to various political things in the Roman Empire, they were all pushed far to the west. So Nostradamus' family originally came from the area between Girona and, say, a little north of Rennes-le-Chateau. Don't know exactly where. But about 100 years before Nostradamus' time, they were allowed to move back to Provence. And Nostradamus' father converted to Christianity and changed the family name to Our Lady, Notre Dame, which in his early years, Michel de Nostradamus went by Mickey of Our Lady. So that's how he signed his student sign-in page at the University of Montpellier. So he was born in Saint-Remy, in his grandmother's house. His grandmother was a local midwife, and he grew up in his uncle's house, who was a notary or a lawyer. And when he was 17, he went off to Avignon to go to university. And unfortunately, before he could finish university, the plague broke out. So he didn't get a university degree from the church school in Avignon. So he came back to Saint-Remy and talked his dad into giving him his inheritance up front, which was a sort of a tradition for eldest sons if they wanted to go out and make their thing in the world. The dad would say, okay, well, here's probably what you get when I die, so here it is in cash. Hit the road. So Nostradamus started off for his first wandering period. Traveled all over southern France. We can trace some of the references he makes in letters by tracing where the major Jewish families were that he would have been related to. And they match pretty well, some odd places. And he ended up in the western part of southern France, a little town called Agen, studying with one of the brightest minds of the Renaissance, a fellow by the name of Julius Caesar Scaliger. And he was so taken with him that he was still effusively praising him even long after Scaliger had stabbed him in the back and so forth. And even named his son Caesar after his old mentor. So this was Nostradamus' happy period. He got married, had a wife, 2 kids, and the plague hit. And that was a little bit more than he could take, so he started on his second wandering period. And a decade or so later, he turns up in Marseille and Aix, the Provence, where he miraculously cuts the duration of the plague from its usual 6 to 8 months and 30,000 people to under 3 months and less than 10,000 people, for which he got enormous reputation as a doctor and a healer and sort of a, how should we say, a civic designer. And from that, he got a notoriety and got plugged into the right political circles. So he married a wealthy widow in Ceylon. And almost as soon as they were married, he arranged for the house to be renovated so that he could have a private tower to do his hoodoo in, and then he headed off to Italy. And he stayed in Italy around Torino for, depending on which authority you want to believe or trust, anywhere from 8 months to 5 years. But he was successful in ensuring that Marguerite de Savoy had children. Now this was important because she was the sister of the King of France. And if she had not had children, then the whole Savoy property in northern Italy would have passed to the King of France. So Nostradamus ensured that she had children and the House of Savoy continued. And he may or may not have left an enigmatic prophecy on a plaque in a farmhouse in Turin. That's still up and down. But by 1556, he was back in Ceylon, and he was writing almanacs. Now, the almanac was the hot thing of the day. Everyone wanted to know what the stars foretold, and when to plant, and when was a good time to start your war, or steal your neighbor's cattle, or whatever. And so they were very popular. Everyone read them, from anyone who could read all the way up to King Henry II. So Nostradamus' almanacs were enormously popular, mainly because he would have prophecies for every month. He would have a little 4-line poem saying what he thought was going to happen that month. Now you got to understand, Nostradamus was an astrologer, sort of, but even in his lifetime, he was criticized for his bad astrological talents. In other words, he really couldn't cast a horoscope to save his life. Which is interesting because he got rather famous for that. He made quite a bit of money off of it. But the almanacs and the astrology in the almanacs, they have these huge flaws and so forth. So somewhere later in there, he got the great idea of writing the complete and eternal prophecies. Now, most people think the prophecies are predictions into the future, but they really weren't. They were trying to have a sort of a cyclical, branching, alternate future, possible future sort of pattern. And he meant it to be the summation of all prophecy. Are we too loud? Or?
No, it's just checking on that. If we want you the cheese, I told him to put it all away here.
So it would sort of be like an eternal prophecy, that things could relate to the past, things could relate to the present, things could relate to the future. And you would never quite know which future was which until it happened. There were always several alternate branches of the future in the prophecies. For instance, there's a prediction about Henry II that he would live and that all his sons would be kings and he'd be the great king of France, etc. And then there's the other one where he dies in a tournament with a splinter through his head and a horrible death. And he wrote those two prophecies at the same time. One came true, one didn't. So we can use that as a model for, okay, well, maybe that wasn't trying to be rigidly in 1999, this will happen, in 2001, this will happen, in America and China. No, he was trying to get some sort of larger pattern of how history repeats itself and how there are branching paths. Things move in different ways. You get a certain point, you respond to it, and then the future is different. So that's a pretty fascinating view. He also made a lot of money with Adam Crampon building the great canal across the Grail. And by the time he died, the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, had appointed him one of the royal counselors, and she actually came through Ceylon in 1564 just to see him. And he made one of his most famous prophecies, which is not in the prophecies, during that visit, because in her train was Henry of Navarre, who would be Henry IV of France. Now, no one would have imagined that 12-year-old Henry of Navarre would ever have become king of France. If you had sat down and tried to figure out how that could possibly happen, given all of Catherine de' Medici's children, it's like, okay, no way. But Nostradamus said, okay, this kid is going to be king of France one day. And apparently he did it through some sort of palmistry or phrenology, because he surprised Henry one morning at his toilet while he was naked and counted the moles on his back or something and said, oh, he's going to be the king of France.
Oh, jeez.
So that one very spot on prophecy.
He found him naked in order to see him.
To see what his birthmarks. So one prophecy that Nostradamus made that literally has come true. He said that 500 years after his birth, he would be more famous than ever, and that only then would people begin to understand what he was doing. Well, 500 years after his birth was 2003, and the most searched for item in the fallout from 9/11 was the false Nostradamus prophecies about 9/11. So literally since his 500th birthday, it's been a steady climb for 100 years or so. It went, and that's the reason why I've done 9 Nostradamus TV shows since 2003. So that's one prophecy that he got very accurately, that 500 years after his birth he was going to be a very popular man. So the Nostradamus sort of part of the story is a connector. And the connector is, in 6 quatrains, he wrote about a great secret hidden under Mont Cossier, the holy mountain up south of town. And there's some really strange stuff in it, we'll talk about it. And he could be talking about where they hid that mysterious slab of stone with the arc on it and the knee print. Now, one of Nostradamus' sort of contemporaries was Leonardo da Vinci. Nostradamus would have been about 12 when da Vinci traveled through here on his way from Italy to northern France. And da Vinci actually rode right through this area. And earlier than that, he painted two paintings that have references to the Grail mystery in Provence. One, the Adoration of the Magi, back to our old friend Balthazar. And the second was the first version of the rocks, Virgin of the Rocks. Now, you can see when we go over to the quarry what Leonardo was trying to show in terms of the place of Virgin of the Rocks. But at that point, he hadn't seen it. It had been described to him. So, that's curious. But in 1513, he actually traveled through here, and he painted one of his most famous paintings, and enigmatic paintings, StJohn the Baptist as Dionysus or Bacchus, in a spot that's still locatable up on the hill.
That with a finger pointing up?
Yes. It's not pointing up. One finger is pointing toward the Holy Mountain and Lebeau, and the other finger is pointing to his knee. And in the painting, StJohn as Dionysus is prominently shown with his knee out thrust, and he's pointing at it. So, stone with a knee print in it, Leonardo's enigmatic painting pointing to the knee. What did Leonardo know? So, when you combine those, you begin to see, okay, at least as late as the 16th century, Nostradamus' time, and Leonardo's time, the secret was still available. Plus, Nostradamus didn't know Leonardo and didn't know about Leonardo's paintings when he wrote the 6 famous quatrains about the hidden mystery under Mount Gaussian. So that's 2 independent sources. So that's 2 of our 3 threads. Not 1. 3 threads.
There's a question.
Yes.
In the word explanation of the Lotto, they said that he was commissioned to do that painting by a group of, I couldn't look at it.
The Adoration of the Magi or Virgin of the Rocks?
Virgin of the Rocks.
Oh, yes. And they didn't like it. They made him paint another version that's now in the National Gallery in London. Because no one had halos, and you couldn't tell which was Mary, which was Jesus, which was John. And again, it's like the story is being compounded by that confusion. So our third thread is the very famous Impressionist painter Vincent van Gogh, or Gogh, for those who are from Belgium, living there. And
Thank you.
Van Gogh, yes, was bipolar, and yes, he drank way too much absinthe, and yes, God knows what was going on in his brain, and you either like him or you don't like him, depending on whether you've actually seen the original or just reproductions. However, he was so into the vibe here in Arles that he went totally over the top. The light, the color is the light, etc. So after he had his manic phase of his bipolar disorder in Arles, he came right up here, around the corner, under Mount Gaussier, to an insane asylum to recover. And as he was recovering, he would walk through the hills, paint the cottages, paint the olive trees, and he did his most famous painting, Starry, Starry Night, which has an opposite perspective. In other words, you could see where you could stand on the Mount Gaussier and look and see the same view that's in Starry, Starry Night, except that Van Gogh painted it as if he were hanging in space somewhere out here, right about where we are, looking back toward town, Saint-Remy, and Mount Gaussier. So Van Gogh independently picked up on whatever the energy is here. So if we use that as sort of our 3 threads we're going to look at, is we're going to follow around the Holy Grail, Nostradamus, and Leonardo and Van Gogh. And the thread that weaves this together is the idea of an alternative St. John. And the story, in its threads as we run through it, basically connects whoever this St. John as Dionysus is with St. Tropime. St. Tropime was a real first century person who attained a Buddhistic level of enlightenment. All over Tibet, etc., you find these saints, Padmasambhava and so forth, who can melt the rock and put their handprint or their footprint or whatever in it. In the West, we have St. Tropime, who was able to melt the rock and put his knee print. So we're really looking at an art that starts off with the alternative Christianity that was sort of Jewish, sort of pagan, had an exemplar that wasn't Jesus, was known as John, who attained a degree of enlightenment and was able to demonstrate it by leaving his knee print in a tombstone. And that group of believers from, say, 52 AD, when we know the tombstone event happened, we actually have records, actually have reports of how that happened. And the best report we have says that Jesus himself appeared from heaven and blessed the tombstone with his knee print. So there's, in the records, this confusion with Jesus coming down from heaven and the local St. Tropime, St. Trophimius, St. John, who, on another level of reportage, is the one who left his knee print. So even there's that confusion. And then the followers of the alternative Messiah, however you want to put it, enlightened one, include St. Maurice, and whose legion died out to a man, then the Cathars, who were wiped out, and then the people who were followers of and believers in the legend of the Holy Grail. Okay? And that tradition seems to have continued right through Nostradamus' family and right through whatever Cathar, secret societies, etc., informed Leonardo. There's a lot more. That's just a quick overview. We have a whole week. We'll go into all of it. The end of the story, though, is Van Gogh. Because Van Gogh is sort of the proof of the proposition that there is something really intense, magical, energetic, supernatural, super spiritual here in the few kilometers right around the Holy Mountain, etc. Because he was painting wonderful stuff in Arles. He painted wonderful stuff after he moved back to the Loire Valley. But only here did the wonderful stuff literally become transcendental, to the point that you could actually paint the wormhole in the stars, and that the cypress trees come alive. Okay? And it's like, okay, what was he connecting with? And the answer is the energy that's still here. So what we're going to do for the next week is we're going to spiral out from where we are here, and we're going to go look around Saint-Remy and pick up Nostradamus' threads, and then we're going to go look at Glanum and pick up the, what were they now? Proto-Celtic, Ligurian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Hebrew. Pick up those threads, and we're going to go up the mountain. We're going to look at the Grail Castle at Lebeau. We're going to look at the Valley of the Ancients and the Druids and Balthazar. And we're going to go down to Arles. We're going to look for Van Gogh's ghost on the Place de Republic, looking for that next shot of Absinthe. Then we're going to go play with the gypsies down at the Grail procession. And then we're going to go visit Mary Magdalene's caves. Curiously enough, 2 out of the 3 Mary Magdalene caves had in them Buddhist statues from the 2nd century BC. The heads had been knocked off by the original discoverers, which were medieval probably, but they're very Indian seated Buddhas. So that tradition also made its way here. And Mary Magdalene, with her idea of the hermit cave attaining enlightenment, is just another piece of that puzzle. Now, the story about Mary Magdalene is that she was first meditating in the cave over next to Nîmes. And by the way, she probably didn't come from Palestine, she probably came from here, because Magdalene, the tower, Magdala, actually exists outside Nîmes. It's a large, enormous Roman tower, and most of it's still there. And you can see her original hermitage, the hillside of her original hermitage is from the tower. So the story is that the angels took pity on her at this poor site over next to Nîmes, and they flew her in a straight line, which passes right over where we're sitting, to the second hermitage cave down in the Lebanon. Okay? So it's like, okay, so we have an enlightened female saint who flies along the ley line and meditates in the two caves that Buddhist statues have been found. Oh, and she had some sort of child with her when she showed up. Could that child be StJohn, St. Trophimus? One more little piece of the puzzle. St. Paul reports that he was competing with this mysterious Hebrew holy man called the Egyptian in Jerusalem right before he got shipped off to Rome. And he wasn't winning against the Egyptian. The Egyptian actually collected a large group of pre-fall of the temple, pre-diaspora Christian Jews from Jerusalem, Holy Land, etc., and sailed back to the west. So could that have been St. John, the Egyptian, Gypsy, Egyptian, etc.? All of these fall within the same time period. Okay? So all of these little threads give us this sort of picture of the larger puzzle, but only if you actually get out and walk to these spots and look and feel and try to put it into the three levels that we're going to be looking at, do you begin to see that, okay, wait a minute, there's really something here. We may not be able to actually precisely identify and date, but it's still here in the land. The trees remember, the water remember, the rocks remember. All we have to do is connect, like Van Gogh, and our consciousness can go transcendental. So that's what we have planned for the next week. Transcendental consciousness by way of Holy Grail mysteries, and Nostradamus, and DaVinci.
And a great history expert.
Yes.
Thank you, Vincent.
What we're going to talk about for the next week is the literal summation of my life's work as an historian. I started working on this in high school. So this is 40 years worth of goodies. All for you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there any questions?
Put this on the internet?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, we're going to sell some books.
What were the techniques that Nostradamus used to, be so effective against the plague that nobody else was using? Were they unique discoveries that he
No,
did?
no. Very simple, very basic. Clean your house. Get rid of the rats. Flush all the garbage out of the streets with water. He believed in water. Flush it out. And he also had developed lozenges that had camphor and rose hips. And the camphor, of course, would keep the fleas away. Rose hips would boost your immune system. Valerian and a few other things like that would help boost your immune system. He believed in bleeding, which was a medieval technique. It could seem to be effective, but if it didn't, there were other things to do. So basically, his approach to the plague was nothing miraculous. It was just simple, basic hygiene and common sense, which seemed to be really rare among the civil authorities at that point. What? You mean everybody needs to bathe every day? What? We have to sweep the sewage out of the streets every week? Oh my God.
Have they connected it to rats yet?
No, there hadn't been a direct connection, but there had to have been some awareness because of the camphor. In other words, a strong smell of camphor. He would make the pills, called the rose pills, into lozenges, and you were supposed to just continually keep one going all the time. And that would, the camphor would run the fleas off. But yeah, the cleanliness in terms of getting rid of, the stench of the sewage, that would clean out the rats. Flushing your street down once a week with water, that would clean the rats out. this, remember, was at a time, we're going to walk through some of these streets, in which if you did not want some housewife's slop jar on your head, you really had to walk carefully, because the sewer is right down the middle of the street. And you can still see it over in Salmer Mead. Fortunately, the sewer is now below the level of the street, but you can still see where it was. So all of that was just common sense, just good practical hygiene that had a pronounced effect. It's hard to say that Nostradamus was really mystical. He always claimed that he was no seer, that he wasn't a prophet, that he worked all of this out logically through what he called judicial astrology, which was the astrology of large groups of people, countries, etc. And okay, that's a good technique to start from, but there had to be more to it. And the more to it was an awareness of these larger cycles of time. Because the prophecies are written as this large, almost processional year-long cycle, 26,000-year-long cycle, in which things would events and people and happenings would repeat according to some process that may be astrological, may not. It's hard to say. So.
And your take on the Mary Magdalene being born here, are you going to go into that a little bit further and later on?
Oh yeah, we'll go over to the meeting and we'll look at the tower, and we'll go on from the tower over to her first meditation spot.
Is there other people that, is this, because that's a new theory for me, is this something that's being discussed at the moment, or is it your theory, or other authors?
Okay, that's my theory. This is the first time I've ever told Dan, particularly with a camera or a keyboard in his hand, because I did not want it out to the universe until I was ready. So there you go. That's my theory. That's my deduction.
That's fascinating.
But there are other things that other people have come up with that help it fit. But that one's mine.
The Leonardo painting, there's an archway, isn't there, with a rock in the background?
That's right.
Is that the one I've got? Is that the picture?
Yeah, that's right.
That's
And
what I
we're
saw.
going to go see it.
When we drove around the corner, right, and I just put the pictures in everything with it. Yeah. And you can see the rock and the shape of the rock.
Well, there's actually the quarry where the old town of Glanham was cut from the rock.
So does that sort of suggest that this was common knowledge at the time of Leonardo, or at least it was?
Among certain
Underground
circles,
knowledge,
yeah, among certain circles. The quarry where they built Glanham from, they left what they call here the Les Pyramides, but it's just a big spire of rock. And the point of leaving the big spire of rock was to show how far down into the hillside they had cut. Because the top of the rock is the original surface, and then left this one spire in the quarry. It's very common for the Romans to do that. However, the quarry over in Glanham is the only one of those left. In other words, out of all the Roman quarries where we hear about those kind of quarry marks, it's the only one left. And they quarried back into the hill in these caves that's now this lovely family's farm. And you can actually walk into the cave, stand where Virgin of the Rocks is set, and look out and see that exact rock in the background. Now, it's not 100% accurate because, like I said, someone described it to Leonardo. He didn't actually get here to see it until later. But, depending on a couple of things, we can get pretty close to the exact spot where Leonardo drew the sketch. We actually have one of the sketches from 1513 that showed some local goat herder guy sitting on the rock and posing. So Leonardo found a specific spot up on the hill where you could see Lebeau, and was also pretty close to the intersection line of where the 5 major connector points cross and come together.
I got a picture of the painting if you want to see it, but I just can't manage to play it. I got a video of both those paintings in the Louvre on here, but I can't figure out how to get it.
We'll see them later.
Maybe tomorrow
We'll
morning.
show them around.
Vincent, the theory about Mary Magdalene being born here,
Well, okay, it depends on how you want to plug what we know on certain levels about the Magdalene into the story. She was obviously Jesus' wife. The wedding at Cana is obviously his, probably to her. So why exactly would that be an important marriage at that point? Well, if he were actually of the Hasmonean royal family, House of David, then it wouldn't be good politics to just marry anybody from around. However, for 100 to 150 years, the Hebrew community between here and Nîmes, etc., was getting more powerful, more wealthy, more cosmopolitan. And the story is that Sarah the Egyptian was here and greeted Mary Magdalene and the other two Marys when they arrived.
Just turn it off for now, Dave.
Yeah, please,
Let's have a look at it tomorrow morning.
you're cutting into our thing here. So, again, how you plug that in and how you plug some of the other stories about Mary Magdalene. She obviously wasn't just a refugee. If there was someone here waiting for her, that it was also considered a princess. And again, the Magdala in Hebrew and the Magna Tura, great tower above Nîmes, is really almost too close. And then the stories about the hermitage spots. You know, would a refugee know where these sacred, going back to Buddhist time, meditation days were? I mean, from the Roman tower, you can actually see the hill where her first meditation spot was. So all of these things together sort of say that, well, you know, she wasn't a refugee, that this was coming home to her native land. And Christianity spread so fast that if we think of, say, I don't know, 46 AD as a good date for when the Mary Magdalene and Lazarus, the whole family of Jesus, Mary Salome, etc., all landed at St. Marie de Mur, and 10 years later, 56, the Egyptian is recruiting people back in Jerusalem to come to this new Christian Hebrew land, then that's like 10 years for a very obscure mystery cult to spread so widely and so powerfully. And that could really only happen if you were a native, if you were some influential nobility of the region. If you just said, oh, there's a bunch of refugees here and they believe in this guy, you know, etc., that may or may not wash. But if it was some locally connected, traditionally current, you know, that had Hebraic roots and also the roots from right here, again, the Buddhist tradition, Egyptian tradition, then it suddenly begins to make more sense of why this would just flower so suddenly and so incredibly here. Does that help?
And it also makes sense of why the Christian church is so threatened by it.
Yes, in other words, this is a Christianity that's not really Christian, and is based on the fact that, well, you know, we all know Mary Magdalene was Jesus' wife. You know, what first century Hebrew rabbi didn't have a wife? And oh my God, if he didn't have a wife, they would be writing all these nasty things about him, and, you know, would have survived. You know, here was this unmarried guy traveling around with 12 dudes in the desert. You know? I mean, that's either a gay orgy or an invitation for, you know. So it's like, all right, he was married. Obviously, the wedding at Cana was his. A pure academic, a lovely old man, Professor Phelps, wrote a book about this in the early 70s, in which he fairly conclusively proved that Jesus had to have been married, and that the wedding at Cana had to be to Mary Magdalene, etc. And it's like, okay, that's fairly good scholarship. Dr. Phelps is in fact the one who started this whole thing that grew into Dan Brown and, you know, all the Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It was his little book, his thesis from graduate school in theology. It was whole thing on.
Is he still alive?
Oh yeah, he's still on.
And did he write any other books out?
No, he still
That was the one that
teaches.
set it all for him.
Yeah, that was his doctoral thesis. I mean, he's published a few articles, but I was on a TV show with him right during the height of the Dan Brown era. He was just sort of vaguely amused and bemused that anybody was taking him seriously, and this whole thing had grown out of his basic idea. Sweet man. So yeah, it's like, okay, you put these pieces together, then what makes the most sense? Well, what makes the most sense is looking here for the sources.
Thank you. Super.
Anybody else? Yes?
The St. John you were referring to, you said earlier in the band that it wasn't John the Baptist,
That's right.
but is it John the Evangelist or
No,
John?
it's
Book
St.
of
John
Revelation,
Trophimus.
John? Okay.
In other words, the tradition that we can sort of infer from a couple of different sources is that whoever that child, son of Mary Magdalene was, he was named John. St. Trophimus is referred to as John when he has a given name. And Leonardo's painting, St. John as Dionysus, is only called John the Baptist because we don't have any other thing to refer it to. What pagan Dionysian St. John could that be? And then all of the crusading orders, the Templars, the Knights of St. John, all have the connection to a St. John. Which one is it? Plus, the Cathars had a version of the Gospel of John, the parts that seem to be written in first person. That was part of their Gospel of Love. So, which St. John is which? It even gets funkier all the way over in the far western end of the Pyrenees in Basque land. Because the Basques were not conquered by the Romans, they were still pagan in Roland's time, and they only really, in a limited sense, absorbed any Roman, Latin loanwords. Yet, they have the story of a St. John who traveled into the underworld to make a deal with the great mother goddess Marie, and he's still there, according to their tradition. In the sense that there is St. John of the Rock. And there is a rock down the beach from San Sebastian, Hendaye, in which St. John is supposedly living in until the end of time, when he will come out. Now that's a Basque version that seems to be so early, so early that we don't really know how it could have gotten transmitted. But you just so happen to find the same myths right around here. The end of this ley line is at St. Roche, the Holy Rock. Right? And one arm of the pentagram goes up into the Luberon to a little, very strange little cave where StJohn, G-E-N, is said to be hiding in the rock until Judgment Day. So it's like, how many of these same overlaps do we have before we go, wait, they're all telling the same story? So that's why it's St. John.
You should mention that the original discussion that Vincent and I had, which led to our doing the stance this time, was Vincent had concluded that the geometry of the major magnetic sites around here were pent, and several were Magdalene caves,
Well,
Migdal to Tower.
they're all Magdalene locations. That's really how one arc of this whole story started, was I read the legend about flying from the cave near Nîmes to the one down at, Lebon. Okay, straight line. And guess what? That straight line passed really close to Glanum and Montpensier. Like, okay. And then I connected from sort of Glanum area up to the third Mary Magdalene cave up in the Ardèche. And that went right up through where we were today on the rock up to Durance and right up. On the rock at Avignon is an ancient pagan grotto, sacred spring, coming out of this 1,000-meter high rock in the bend of the river. Perfect sacred site. That's one line. So I said, okay, there's 3, and this one's at a weird angle, like it's going to be a pentagram. So what could be this line? Well, St. Marie de la Mer was obvious. What other Marian site could be more powerful than that? And that, of course, ran perfectly to the intersectional point of the others. But what went out from there? Well, it seemed that that line didn't really connect to anything. But I kept looking, and the point where it crossed the line from the R dash to the bottom, the top line of the triangle, the point where the line from St. Marie Delaware through here touched was nothing on the map. It was nothing. It was a little bend in the road down from, the Fontaine de Vaucluse is down here, and there's a couple of these really amazing fountain sites, but nothing there. I kept looking, kept looking, kept looking. Finally, I found one small reference in a guidebook to the Hermitage of StJohn. And the more I began to look it up, the more stuff I found, it was like, okay, there is spring, like the Fontaine de Vaucluse and the other weird springs up on the new ground there. And the story is that he closed himself up in the rock. He's waiting in the rock like the St. John over in Basque Country for the end of the world. So St. Roche, St. Roch, St. John, St. John. It's like, okay, and now we have a very nice five-pointed star.
Repent and be saved.
That's right. And the intersection point, curiously enough, happens to be the spot where Leonardo painted St. John's Dionysus pointing to his knee.
We should mention that one of the ancient roots of the word John is eon, which means ion or StJohn, as in to branch perfectly. And the geometry of
Zion, Skion.
right, the geometry of the pent here is what I call charge compression or fractality, which I believe is the physics of what's Grail. So what fascinated me is that this is a lineage of beings who understood that if you get to the center of where charge is compressed appropriately, that you get that perfect branching, perfect fractality, and charge distribution, at which point your plasma could inhabit the rock, actually. And another little aside to the story is, when Vincent was telling me of traveling to Padmasambhavas, where he put his handprint in the rock, and then Vincent says, oh yes, Padmasambhava is another name for Sam, is in Samuel, which is another name for Enki, whose lineage was called
Wow, damn. What was that, 45 seconds? That was incredible.
Without saying Enki. So the point, it referred both to a bloodline or a principle of branching in the bloodline, and the lineage of that bloodline was called Patav, as in Patal, and also Bohem, as in Bohemia, and Bohemite and Bogomil. And so the connection between the perfect branching in blood and the perfect branching in magnetism in the land is the place where plasma can be compressed and therefore be distributed, which is the physics of life force, and which is where your ancestors do live in the land where the branching is perfect. The principle of John, or as we say in America, the chip off the old block, which is actually a name for the principle of fractality in my view, which is who John Eon was, emerging from the Migdal, which is where the magnetism makes a tower. Migdal.
Okay. That's
and John was the traditional Hebrew firstborn name.
That's right.
Yeah. So the branch from the family would be the first Zion.
Yes, the first.
Where did Zion?
Yes, the priority.
Can I go back to Zion in France?
Absolutely.
In Switzerland, sorry. S-I-O-N.
Meaning to branch.
There's a major vortex there.
And also
There's the Abbey of St. Marie, where the real Holy Grail cup is to stay.
yes,
That's where I would go and leave it.
yes.
No, it's already
We had
on the way down, on the way down to Malta, we're stopping off there.
we had talked about doing
That's
stuff,
kind of going out around your ass to get to your elbow.
We never
That
will.
would be a fun drive.
but we had talked about doing that an event at StJohn, and we did an event at StJohn about the Grail Mysteries with Ananda, and indeed that is the root of what he believed was 5 major watersheds.
It is.
And that's in fact, and then he teaches the legend that the Grail family actually visited Sion, and it goes into a whole history of that.
It would be really interesting to plot some of those some of, what's his name?
Yeah, and
Stefan's place, clocks on there. On the journey around those, I was
Can you
thinking.
explain where in Switzerland Sion?
Sion is about,
It's
it's about an hour and a half drive from Vevey or Lausanne, where Stefan Cardinal
Yeah,
lives.
there's slightly less than that.
So toward the center of Switzerland.
And there's a big sort of semi-caldera or two there
Yeah,
that joins back on the water that comes out of that, because I was up there just recently.
yes.
That is so sweet.
The people who run the spiritual center there that we did the lectures at, you would enjoy meeting them.
Okay.
Yes.
Strange where you end up, isn't it?
I'd like to ask you again about the objects affiliated with the Holy Grail. Or can you just talk a bit more about them?
Well,
and
have you
why
ever seen
they might have taken those forms?
well, have you ever seen a deck of tarot cards?
The tarot. The tarot card.
The four sets of the tarot: swords, wands, spears, cups, discs.
For tarot cards.
Yeah, that's the four suits. Those are the four hallows, the four sacred objects. The sword, Charlemagne's sword, spear of destiny, the wand,
Sort of luncheons.
the Holy Grail cup, and the plate or the platter.
That would
Yes.
just dissolve as needed. And you see, if you get enough charge in the plasma of your body, you melt the stone. And that's actually the physics of complete.
Which is one way to demonstrate that you attained your diamond body like Padmasambhava did in
That's right.
the Asura cave in Nepal.
Yeah, but now to go back to the symbolism of the tarot cards and the Holy Grail, just can we go to a deeper level? Why that symbolism? I mean,
I would take the four elements: air, fire, water, and earth.
Or where charge is projective, it's a line sword. Where charge is receptive, it's a grail cup, etc., etc. The four primal symmetry sets or something.
One element missing there, fire.
No? Fire is one. Spear. Air, sword. Spear, wand, fire. Cup, water. You know, disc, platinum, platter, earth. What's missing is spirit. And spirit may be implied, but there's no particular hallow for it in that tradition.
It was really recently that the Basques had DNA connections back to the Berbers. So that might be another voyage you might want to take.
You know, the Berbers and also the Incas, there's genetic similarities between the Incas and the Basque. And so, who knows?
And in Templar terminology, Berber was related to Bar Bar, as in Simon Bar Jonah, which meant
No,
in the
it's the son of.
so, well, it meant in the line of or son of, and the meaning was similar. That the line of Bar is in Santa Barbara, but there's a Bar south.
Bar was what the Greeks called the barbarians because the Celtic language to them sounded bar.
But the
And the
Templars
Berbers were called barbarians, Berbers, by the Greeks. That's how they came to the Berbers. So Barbara is not quite the same as Berber or barbarian.
But when William Buller in the Templar tradition talks about Bar in south, is it?
Morocco.
Yeah.
South, yeah.
But there's a Barber down south, southern Europe as well. And it was
in Prague, though, in Czech Republic, Saint Barbara was named Barbara because she was the daughter of the barbarians, and they didn't have a name for her. Wasn't it the
So
story?
that's a little bit funky, Danny,
Isn't it the same
etymology.
thing?
in the line of. A lot of times, a site named Bar is named that because it's in a particular energy line. That's what the point is.
Okay.
And it relates to the sense of son of, Simon Bar Jonah, which is in the line of. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
do you think the Vatican would have that particular view, or there would be information around that about the Mary Magdalene?
I sincerely hope not. Otherwise, we'll never see it again. It's already been destroyed. And if the Catholic Church had the authority, let us not forget, our present Pope was formerly the head of the Inquisition. Yes, Inquisition still exists. If they had the power, you betcha they'd have us all burned tomorrow.
Well, that's nice.
Let's hope they never get that
Impossible
power.
as it sounds. What are you trying to say?
It's like the words just were.
Have you thought about the sort of power that they do have today in relation to the power that they wielded, for example, in the time of the Cathars?
Sure, let's hope it's going downhill so fast we'll see the end of it before the end of my lifetime.
And factors for it dissipating?
Well, that's a much larger topic. But you'll notice when we go down into San Remini that almost every street corner will have its Virgin Mary, the Holy Child. That's Isis and Horus.
Absolutely.
You know, it's the same iconography. So all of these little towns in this, what used to be a stony desert region before the Romans built the aqueducts, every little town has a spring at the center of town, and every little town had its mother goddess. And the spring is still there, it's usually in front of the town hall, and the mother goddess is still worshipped via the Virgin Mary on every street corner. And it's like, okay, the goddess of the springs, and the springs giving life, no matter what you call it, it's still the tradition here.
So we're talking about a layered religious understanding and growth. And StJohn as Dionysus, the painting that we referred to earlier. I'd love you just to expand a bit about the connection of Christianity and the ancient Dionysian.
None. Christianity is Apollonian to the core. They are absolutely afraid to this day of anybody that has a Dionysian, spiritual, Gnostic, crazy out of their mind experience. It's like, okay, well, we'll use that if we can, but would you please stop floating up in the ceiling of the church? You're going to give us a... So they're still terrified of that. That's why calling the St. John as Bacchus is indicating that this is something as far away from Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity as it's literally possible to get.
Vincent is public relations agent for the Pope.
Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing me into the Catholic Church.
As you talk, I keep getting flashes of the theme. You know, there's little bits of the flashes of the god of the wind, and you know, the angel of the air, and the angel of the water. A little bit of flashes of that keep coming through, and it feels like that's relevant to this
Well, it
game
is,
we're
but
playing now.
I'm not going to go into the Palestinian origins of Christianity before it came west.
Yeah.
That's a whole deep, disputed subject. But let us just say that it is no accident that there are so many similarities between ancient Egyptian religion and the Gnostic Christianity of the Hebrews that came west.
And
No accident.
in between that, you have the Essene.
The problem with what we say is the Essenes is we really don't know as much about it as we think we do. And the library at Qumran is actually the library from the Temple of Jerusalem. So that whole Essene thing is confused because we really haven't put the archaeology and the text in the right place.
And the greatest library that was ever held on that was in Austria.
Austria?
Yeah, in Austria, the Habsburgs have it, apparently. As
Rome,
well as Rome.
They probably stole it from Prague at the end of the 30 Years' War.
Yeah.
Vincent, what do you think of the prophecy that the next part will be the last?
Oh yeah, good old St. Malachy of Ireland, and the identifications of the motto folks. That started in the wake of Our Lady of Fatima, back after the First World War, and John Paul II is the one who made it almost a doctrine of Catholic faith, which is funny because the number in the sequence he thought he was very close to the end. So yeah, and Pope Benedict tried to choose something that would be not in the current as much as possible, and still couldn't. It still fits very closely. And of course, the last time there was a Pope Benedict was one of the anti-popes that were in Avignon. So I've always thought that was coming. But yeah, according to St. Malachy, there's one more Pope after this one. Let's hope he's right.
Well, I think everybody's ready to go to bed here shortly.
Yeah, I think it's about time.
It's
to
time
finish.
for-
I'm sure it's funny.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Roger, for bringing us here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're quite welcome.
Well, we're off to a good start.
My
Yes.
pleasure.
Good start. And tomorrow morning?
Well, I would say breakfast between 8:30 and 9.
Okay.
Sounds good.